Hi, Tansegwakia. Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction, and thank you, Creative Mornings, for including me bringing me into your community. It's an honor to be here today. Tansegwakia nia Melina miawafin Laboucan-Massimo nia nihiao kinaskuntanawao. That's my way of introducing myself to all people when I come into an audience and come into a room of people in Cree. And I'm actually currently on the unceded territory of the Kluhus First Nation. So I'm out in the Northern Gulf Islands. And so if my reception goes wonky, that is why, but it's been holding pretty strong while I've been here. So just wanted to flag that for folks. And so the way that I'm going to present today is that I'm going to show some images from back home and bring you into our homelands, and then also have some closing thoughts after the fact. So you're going to see my face right now, but then we're going to go to actually a PowerPoint right away, and then then I'll come back and talk to everybody about some ideas that I've been thinking about since I've been asked to speak on these issues, and thinking about how we reconnect to nature, especially during this time of COVID-19. So if we can go to my PowerPoint, I'd love to show you what it's like back home. So this is Laboucan territory. I'm Laboucan Cree. I'm from the far north of Alberta, and this is the community that I come from. That's actually my kukum, my grandmother before she passed away, and me in my younger years when I was early 20s. And that's actually my dad in the top. He was actually hidden from residential schools, and he was taken to the trap line with my kukum and Musa, my grandparents, when the Indian agent would come into the community and take the children every fall. So my dad, that picture of him on the trap line with his dog, and he was the only kid that would be left in the community. So it was a very lonely childhood until he went to the day schools, which were still violent places for a lot of young kids. But so that's kind of the history. And the family that I come from is my kukum and my Muslim didn't speak English; they only spoke Cree. So we're from the Northern Boreal. Next slide. So you can see here, I'm sure a lot of folks on the call have heard about the tar sands. I'm not going to go into it too much, but I just want to give you an idea of where we come from and the issues that I'm working on and our connection to nature. But I'm from the Peace Country on the left side in the 141,000 square kilometers of the tar sands. And that's where I was born and raised. And you can go to the next slide. And so you can see here the impact that it kind of spans out, tentacles out from the ground zero of the tar sands all the way out to other places where we see impacts to refinery communities and cancer clusters along pipelines, and here on the West Coast with the super tankers. Next slide. And a part of why I wanted to bring this story into effect, just to not only give you an idea of what it's like to be an Indigenous person from, the northern Alberta, but, these are the types of issues that we deal with. You can learn more about this on YouTube, Oil on Laboucan Land, and some of these pictures that were taken. It was a massive oil spill that kind of cued me into wanting to build a renewable energy future, and what Creative Mornings is all about, of what is a creative response to the impact when you have a negative, this was actually quite traumatic and terrifying experience of my family not being able to breathe. Their eyes were burning, their stomachs were turning. All of these types of issues were happening in our territory. My family texted me and said, "Can you come home? We don't know what's happening." And it was a massive oil spill, 4.5 million liters spilled into our traditional territory, into our waters. And so this is what happened. And you can see in the bottom slide, we went back 18 months later, and they said it had been cleaned up, and I was still pulling out toxic sludge. And that area that you can see by me in the bottom was toxic sludge that there was no life. It was just a dead pool, dead zone. And you can see tracks still of animals in and around. The top one was at the very beginning, where you could see beaver dams taken over and young cubs and animals being impacted. So there's a lot of impact, as you can imagine, on Mother Earth when these types of things happen. Next slide. So, and also not only to nature, but also to the humans and Indigenous peoples in impact zones that live in and around these intense fossil fuel extraction zones. such as these young, beautiful children that are my cousin's kids who were playing outside. You know, we took this picture right after the spill, and my family, the community, was not told to evacuate, so they were left to breathe in these fumes for weeks after. The school was closed down because the teachers couldn't even teach because it was making people feel so sick. But yet, pregnant women, small children, and also elders with immunocompromised systems were not told to leave the community. They were left to suffer within the community, and some people still left anyways on their own. But it was just not a government. The government wasn't looking after the people or the corporation responsible for this. Next slide. So, in the era right now with as we reflect on nature, all of us know the issue of climate change. So I'm not going to go into it very much today. But, these are the impact zones of the tar sands where we're from. Is 106 of Canada's fresh water supply is being contaminated, being drained, like you can see here with the glacier-fed water systems. And also, you can also see the woodland caribou, which will be extinct or locally extirpated in the area by 2040. So we're talking about a huge swaths of land that actually help us deal with climate change, with the northern boreal forest, the lungs of Mother Earth, all of these things that are so important to us as people to be able to breathe oxygen are being taken down for the extraction processes of the tar sands. Next slide. So I'm going to bring these words into, we talk about reconciliation, but with reconciliation is truth. And so we need to talk about these words of cultural and environmental genocide, where we see all of this beauty of Indigenous cultures and further encroachment, contamination, destruction of our territories, and what does that result in? A loss of culture, tradition, and customs, a loss of spirituality because we can't practice in those sacred places because they are being destroyed or contaminated. We go into the forest and the boreal, and we think about should we be harvesting these medicines? Are they contaminated? My dad, who's a hunter, he's found moose that have tumors in the carcass that are yellow inside because they've been contaminated. So there's these types of issues that we're dealing with here and now. Next slide. And so you can see this is what, industrialized landscapes look like replaced afterwards, drained and polluted watersheds and contaminated air. Next slide. So this leads me to creativity and what Creative Mornings is all about, of what does a just transition look like. And for me, after experiencing these things as a young person, and then also coming into, my teenagehood and into my 20s and started campaigning on these issues, I realized, yes, I can speak about these issues, and yes, I can raise awareness, and yes, I can travel around the world, and yes, I can testify before US Congress, or I can go to the UK Parliament and talk to them about these issues and try to bring divestment and bring renewable energy into the fold. But if I'm only talking about horrible things and not talking about the visioning and the beauty that I want to see in the world, the creativity, the innovation, then I feel like I'm still failing my family, because I can raise awareness about the oil spill, but if I just talk about that, but I don't talk about something that we want to build, the future that we want to see, this is why, for me, a just transition is creativity, is bringing in renewable energy, is bringing in innovative projects, because each project looks different in each community, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as in my closing thoughts. But this is, for me, creativity, a creative response to a very negative and very traumatic experience that we had from an oil spill. Next slide, please. So from an Indigenous perspective, our Indigenous worldview and philosophy is much more in alignment with renewable energy because it's more regenerative and less extractive. I mean, we're still figuring out how to make things even more sustainable. And I think that's a part of innovation. That's a part of creativity in how we respect our relationship with Mother Earth, how we bring about change with Mother Earth, and not completely always extracting. Next slide. So this is a part of the work towards this, of bringing in community-based solar, and that's what we did back home. If you go to the next slide, you can see a couple of photos. This is the first time we've ever had solar panels in my community, in Little Buffalo, Alberta, where I was born. And this is Carlton. We trained him. He was 21 at the time. We trained him and many other young people, and also amazing skilled technicians, skilled people, skilled laborers in our community that helped us build this project from the ground up. But yeah, this is the first time we've ever had panels in our community. So it was a really exciting time. If you go to the next slide. You can see us building. So we did a top of pole mount system, which is different. A lot of times people are used to seeing ground mounted systems for renewable energy, but because it's right in the middle of the community, the school's right behind it, the health center's to the right of it, we really wanted to keep it up off the ground so people could still access the land underneath of it and walk through it and admire the panels, not fence it away because they are high voltage. A lot of people, a lot of young people or young kids that are in the school could see them as slides because they are slanted that way. So we had to lift them up off the ground and keep them up and have them as a beacon of hope of this is the type of future that we want to see in response. If you go to the next slide. You can see the final installation. It's a 20.8 kilowatt system. And then you go to the next slide. And part of the creative solutions that we wanted to do in celebration of celebrating, in the heart of the tar sands, was having a celebration of like these young kids who are, all of my cousins' kids and all of my family and community. They actually, put their hands into the cement and their hands are underneath these panels, and they'll always be there to show like when they were 5, when they're 25, these panels are still producing energy for our community. Next slide. Another creative solution we did was, ribbon cutting ceremony and a solar feast. For us as Indigenous peoples, as you heard probably here on the West Coast, potlatching, we have a system called a giveaway system where it helps us redistribute wealth back into the community. And a part of that is always feasting. So giving back to feeding people, gathering, being in community. And so we did a solar feast, which was kind of a play on a cultural way of being in our community. And so that's what we decided to do to celebrate and to show people what we were doing. Next slide. Next slide, please. So some of the other creative solutions is if the government or companies that are a lot of times, sometimes, especially in Alberta, if you can go back to the other slide with the kids, sometimes in Alberta, there's a lot of issue around us not necessarily agreeing with kind of the dominant structures that at play. And so it's up to us to do creative literacy and climate literacy. And I've done media literacy and climate literacy workshops in Indigenous communities since my early 20s, but specifically a part of why climate change exists in all of our communities is because there isn't climate literacy, there isn't energy literacy within our communities. And that's why people don't take it as seriously. They don't think about when they flip on the lights. So that's what we started teaching the young kids in Little Buffalo here, you can see, is about them thinking about this from like a young age. When we first put up the panels, I put up the panels in our community. We put them up about 5 years ago. So 2015, it's been 5 years now. And we started going in and doing energy literacy workshops. And they were so excited, grade 5 to grade 6. They were like, what happens when the sun doesn't shine? What happens? They were just question after question. You could see like there's young people are like thirsty and want to know about this, but you talk to like a 25-year-old, a 35-year-old, or 45-year-old, they don't sometimes seem to care as much. So I think it's like starting young. So this is what's so important in our communities, all communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Next slide. So also part of trying to I created a number of organizations that are Indigenous led. So created Laboucan Solar for my community, created Sacred Earth Solar, learning the lessons of renewable energy implementation and bringing them to other Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. So you can see on our website, you can see more videos. So Sacred Earth Solar. You can go to the website and you can see videos like this picture where we went to Secwepemc territory with the tiny house warriors and built solar panels and solarized their tiny houses as they assert jurisdiction in their homelands. In line of the TMX pipeline that they do not agree with and they do not want to go across their homelands. So these are the types of projects, and unfortunately we've had 4 more projects in 4 more different jurisdictions in BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario, but with COVID, we can't implement this summer, but so we're kind of pivoting and changing of what that looks like as, people stay safe in their homes and stay safe in their communities and don't bring anything to remote communities, as we need all our communities to stay safe at this time. So these are the types of projects we do. And then if you go to the next slide, Another thing that I wanted to mention to folks, that as you sit in your homes and you look for things to watch that are inspiring, because for me, as somebody that is very sensitive to energy, I have a really hard time, I'm sure like everybody, looking online, and like I limit myself with social media right now because just reading so much bad news and so much intensity on the heart. I know it lowers your immunity and lowers your immune system. And I'm just recovering from a health issue. So I'm still in recovery. So I want to watch inspiring things. And something that you can watch is called Power to the People. It's actually a project that I've been a part of for the past 3 or 4 years. We started filming 2 years ago. We went coast to coast, 26 locations across the country, and we profiled projects that are up and running already, research that's up and running, renewable energy in Indigenous communities, from geo-exchange, solar, wind, district energy, all these amazing projects that people don't even think and know that are happening. We have over 2,300 projects in Indigenous communities that are renewable energy, and 180 large-scale revenue-generating wind and solar projects in Indigenous communities across this country. And yet a lot of people don't know that these projects exist. And I think it's so important for these types of stories to be uplifted, because there's already models, there's already mapping, there's already creative, innovative ways that communities are transitioning to a just transition and a just recovery. So you can tune in on APTN, or you can actually stream it online on APTN Lumi for the price of a cup of coffee. I know nobody's getting coffee right now. Everyone's making it at home, but I think it's like $4.99 a month. So, there's a little tagline: if you like the nature of things, you're going to love Power to the People. And David Suzuki is one of my mentors, and he knows that I say this, and he agreed, and he laughed, and he loves the show. So please watch if you feel like watching something inspiring. And I think ultimately we're going to have to, as the pandemic comes to an end within the next year or two, we're still going to have to face the greater issue of climate change. So, we need to arm ourselves with these types of knowledges. Next slide, please. So this is where you can find me. Sacred Earth Solar, as I said. I'm also a co-founder and right now program director of Indigenous Climate Action. And so we have a lot of webinars online that you can also watch during this time to talk about these issues. So please follow us, find me online. I'm really excited to be connected to the Creative Mornings community. And so that's the slide. We can take it off now or leave it up. It's up to you. But I'm going to just talk about a couple more ideas of kind of around exploring and reevaluating our connections to nature, because it's such a sacred one. And so when Mark asked me to speak this month on the issue of nature, I was like, yes, because that is something that I think, especially during this time, during COVID-19, we really need to think about, reevaluate our relationships, not only with one another, but also with the natural world. And thinking about this idea of reciprocity. For us as Indigenous peoples, reciprocity is like one of the foundational teachings. So when we go out and harvest medicine, when we even pick a rock up from the beach, when we have to cut like some ceremonial things down to create like a sweat lodge or anything like that, we always give offerings, we always give back and without taking. And so this is like a foundational teaching for us that we learn as like really young children. And so I think this is something that we need to bring back into our relationships with one another, but also with the natural world. And it's very apparent that we're out of balance right now with our natural world. I think another thing that I was thinking about as, dealing with all of the kind of trauma that we're feeling in our bodies, we're definitely dealing with a collective trauma right now, and something that's going to take time and recovery and healing. But I also think about, what is Mother Earth telling us right now during this pandemic? And actually, are we listening? And I think right now, because we have social media, because we have platforms like this, we can like look away in aversion. We can distract ourselves with like binge watching. And I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes you need to do it. Sometimes you need to distance yourself to get back to a place of balance. But I think one of the things that has been really important for me has been connecting and recommuning with nature, and even taking 10 minutes of silence every day and not engaging with the outside world in sense of technology, but with the natural world, because Mother Earth is talking to us. And if we don't take the time right now to listen, I think it's a missed and lost opportunity. And I think we really need to examine what she's saying, because I truly believe Mother Earth is out of balance because of human activity, and because our relationship is out of balance with Mother Earth. So I think right now what we're being asked to do is to dig deeper, find more creative ways, more loving solutions to the problems that exist in this world, and right our relationship with Mother Earth. And also, how do we take care of the most vulnerable in our society? How do we stop the disrespect of Mother Earth, which is inherently linked with the disrespect of women? Unfortunately, globalization has undermined our capacity to be self-sufficient, has undermined our ability a lot of times to respond to crises like this. And I think it's so important for us right now that we continue to protect workers, protect our communities that are not being cared and exploited for. I think of all the frontline workers that are putting their lives at risk right now. And I just want to shout out to all those frontline workers, especially on a day like today of Happy May Day, everybody. And let's celebrate and let's honor the very hard fought wins that we've had because of the struggle of other people, because of the labor of other people and our predecessors. This shows that we're ultimately a part of this puzzle. We all have a fundamental responsibility to each other, but also a responsibility to Mother Earth. Because one of the things that I really wanted to say, especially when we were filming the TV show, we went into communities, and I just felt so lucky to be able to, I've been able to do that through a lot of my work is go into community and talk with elders and talk with young people. But I talked with this one elder that we're filming with in Nchonglith Nation, and he's a Toloquiet carver, master carver, and his name is Joe Martin. And he said, Mother Earth will take care of our needs, but not our greed. And I thought that was very poignant, because it just shows that, we can't continue to have this extractive type of mentality when it comes to Mother Earth, when it comes to each other. And unfortunately, capitalism drives us into that. We are somehow complicit, but how can we slowly remove ourselves, find creative ways to disengage, and also find ways to build a future that we want to see, one that is based on just transition principles, one that is based on creating love and laughter. And I think this is the thing that I love about Creative Mornings, is that we talk about, for me, when Mark asked me what do I use as creativity, and there's so many forms of creativity. For me, a lot of it is humor, laughter, art, dance, and expression. So as Indigenous peoples, because we've experienced such immense oppression from colonial policies that have literally created genocide upon our people, and we're still reeling from crises of suffering because of the social fabric that has torn apart our communities. It's my dad's generation that, I'm the first generation that didn't go to residential schools, that didn't go to day schools. And so, we're still healing from intergenerational trauma, and we're still actually healing from biological warfare. We right now collectively, as a Canadian society, we're experiencing what Indigenous peoples have experienced 100 to 150 years ago with smallpox and the influenza, and also the tuberculosis. I've had family members that have died in front of me from tuberculosis. And so it's very real for our communities still, facing these epidemics, because some communities were wiped out from 25,000 to 126 people. One of the communities we talked about in Power to the People, in Sechelt, that these are real histories, that a lot of times our collective history we don't know. And so I think that's a part of the trauma, but also a part of the healing is, because we've experienced such dire circumstances, we also have really good humor, and I feel like humor is creative, and laughter is creative because it helps the body heal. And so I think, as we move forward in this time, there's a time to grieve, there's a time for mourning, and then there's a time for healing and recovery. And so I think people are going to be at different levels depending on the impact. And I think all of us are going to be impacted by COVID, but there's different levels of impact. And I think, when I was speaking with David Suzuki earlier this week, we talked about how we're not all in the same boat, but we're all in the same storm. And we all also are in the mega storm of climate change. So there's different levels and different impacts that we're all experiencing. But I think we really need to, what's really apparent with the COVID crisis is that we need to address the inequalities that this crisis has surfaced. You know, how are we going to ensure that communities, such as Indigenous communities that, you know, I come from a community where there's no hospital. There's no, people have to drive 2 hours to even get to a hospital. There's not health services that are adequate to respond to something like COVID. And that's just a lived reality for many Indigenous communities. So we really need to take care of communities that are the most vulnerable, especially when we talk about just transition. There's many Indigenous communities still experiencing impact of climate change and environmental degradation. In Fort McMurray, there was a flood, and they're talking about how the tailing ponds, these toxic sludge tailing ponds, are breaching because of flooding, and there's nobody there to record it and take care of it at times like these. So, and also there's people like our sisters in Secwepemc territory that are really worried about workers and hundreds and hundreds of workers coming into these camps to put up pipelines, but yet it's bringing people in. You know, we've heard about the meat packing impact, where hundreds of people have now been impacted and infected by COVID-19. So we need to really call out the government and say, and stand with communities when communities are under threat. And we really need to think about how civil society can continue to make demands and transform our society and support frontline communities and workers, because that is how we go back to better. You know, how do we go back to normal? I don't think we want to go back to normal. We want to go back to a better than normal scenario. And so that's through accountability, through decolonization, through relearning our collective history, supporting frontline communities, supporting workers. And I think climate change and climate action, as we all move out, you know, there's so many different people on this call today, and you may or may not work on climate action, but we all do have a responsibility to Mother Earth, and that looks different to all of us. But everyone has a skill set of how we can address the bigger issue of climate change as we heal from this COVID pandemic. So I think we really need to look at these ways of how do we find balance? How do we find the balance that we need in bringing back the values of reciprocity, and including our, not only our relationships with one another, but our relationship with nature. And so one of the challenges that I've been challenging myself is to try to sit at least 10 minutes a day in silence and just listen to the natural surroundings, just listen to the birds, listen to whatever you can hear wherever you are sitting. Because I think COVID-19 has literally sent us to our room to think about what we've done. You know, it's like, go to your room, what have you done? And so this is the virus talking to us and saying, go to your room and think about what we've done collectively. And I think as we collectively sit in isolation in our rooms and think about what we've done, let's take the time to commune with nature, and let's take the time to listen while we can. Hi. Thank you very much for listening.
A couple of great lines and great comments and questions, and one of them was in regards to speaking to the word balance we kept hearing, and how we'll be looking forward to this new balance and a new way of thinking and a new way of seeing. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pose that first question to Melina right now, and I'm going to ask you, we all know that when we go back to work, you know, it's going to require a paradigm shift at all stages. And you noted a number of elements such that we could be taking with us. And what tools do we bring with us? And what experiences and tools do we leave behind? When we're talking about creativity, we always talk about that, and you spoke to this, is that we need a new way of seeing and thinking, and that requires creativity. If we go back to our some of our leaders in certain positions, especially when we talk about public affairs and government, they want to take what we had and then shove it back into where it was, whatever that new future is. So what could creativity and our experience at this time help contribute to that, and how are you approaching that?
For me, I agree. I mean, I think a lot of us don't want to go back to normal per se, because we know there is a lot of flaws still, but I think for me, it's continuing to push, you know, on multiple fronts. I think there's like the societal, the individual relationships of bettering those with one another, with our neighbors, with people that do not look like us, or that are not, you know, that we other. But there's also the government policies that really need to be overhauled, especially around renewable energy, a just transition, what we're calling a just recovery. And so I think it's pushing each jurisdiction. A lot of us on the call live in different jurisdictions, but the way the energy grids work is that they're all within their own provincial jurisdiction. So we need to push provincial governments, including the federal government, to continue to overhaul, to allow communities to become more self-sufficient. I think what we've noticed in now is that like food security is a huge thing. You know, we thought it's toilet paper, but it's also food. And how are we growing our own food? How are we saving our own seeds? Because this is a pandemic of great measure, but it's also the first of many with climate change. And climate scientists have been saying that, yes, there will be natural disasters, but there will be things like this, right? Because you know, we're still wondering how did this, and I'm not like going to say that I know, but what I've heard from some doctors is that, and there's still a lot of theories out how this virus came about, but through factory farming, you know, so our ways of the way in which we treat the natural world and ways in which we're not sustainable. So it's like localizing, which I think BC is really good at doing, of like localizing, but localizing even more, becoming more self-sustaining, becoming more energy efficient, becoming like less tied to the things, you know, less tied to the needs that we think that we have. For me, it was always like, oh, I need to go out and have like this delicious dinner to like celebrate something, you know, or whatever. I finished my master's, so I'm going to celebrate. But it's like now I'm like, oh, I have to cook for myself all the time, you know, and how do I be as like thoughtful in that cooking, as like most bare bones in everything. So I think it's like we are in a society where more is better, more is, you know, and it's like we're actually being taught and we have to have less and we need to survive off of less. And we can't, you know, do this Western idea of like living off of 5 worlds that doesn't exist. We need to live off the one planet Earth that we're currently on. So I think there's just a lot of ways to shift the focus of less toilet paper, less everything, and still pushing for, demanding for, and standing up for communities that are, you know, in vulnerable positions and spaces, and pushing for good policy and holding corporations accountable. I think there's just a lot of work that all of us, you know, on this call, I'm sure do, and that needs to continue to work. But how do we work with one another in better ways as well, especially relearning the history of this country, which is now underway.
Yeah, really well said. And I really appreciate the recognition of consumerism and how our recent experience is having us readdress what's important to us and what do we need. Through design, you know, my angle from the International Council of Design is in my work in that field, we talk about creativity, is that we look at the Industrial Revolution as creating some of those professions, but those professions were actually at the mercy of producers and manufacturers to achieve their ends and their goals. And design has shifted from supplying that to now being the ambassadors of the end user. And the end user is a horrible word to actually say our neighbors, our community, our nations, our people. And so how we as creatives and designers, or whatever our role is in this life, is to look at what is tomorrow and how do we reinvent that. That's what I gleaned from this. So thank you for sharing that. We do have some questions and some thoughts from others along the way, and Mark will be looking at a few of them. Mark, did you have any that you wanted to steer the spotlight to so they can ask Melina a question?
Actually,
They're all so shy.
there's one. Karen's gonna jump in here. Go, Karen.
Hey, so I'm gonna ask the question in our group, which was for Melina, was what can we do today? Like we don't have maybe like solar panels or stuff like that, but other than watch the shows that were recommended, and that's pretty awesome. But more like an actionable step towards towards like Mother Earth today.
Oh, sorry. That's me. I forgot. I'm doing that. There you go. Go ahead.
Oh, me?
No, Melina's. Oh, what's happened?
There we go. I just unmute. Yeah, I think we're trying to unmute me at the same time. Yeah, I mean, it's hard as we're stuck in our homes. I think right now devising plans that we can be where we can become more sustainable. And that's why I did recommend Power to the People, because it shows different ideas and modeling that we can utilize for food security, eco-housing, climate change adaptation, like monitoring renewable energy implementation. I saw you said intergeneration. Did you ask about intergenerationally as well, or is that somebody else? No, that's somebody else. Okay, same Karen. So I think that it's just the way that I started doing the solar project was it happened over like a number of years. Like, so it was like, it is the time to like, I know I said, you know, mothers is sending us to our room and saying like, go to your room and think about what you did, but it's also a time to reflect and like envision. And it took me it was about 2.5 years that it took me to put up the project. So like from the time of like envisioning, I went to go do my master's. I was like, this is going to be my thesis. Even one of my professors was like, you know, it's going to take too long. You should just write about it. And I'm like, no, I'm going to implement it. It's going to be a master's degree project, not a paper. And so I think it's just giving yourself the time and space to be able to think about like, who am I in the world? What feels good to me? And then also like, what project can I bring to the world? You know, whether that's like a small scale project within your community, within your family of food security, even like planting some medicines, planting some, you know, basil or like all these medicines that are amazing, or like a small garden, or like a community-wide project, which is what I decided to do. Like there's all these things that we can envision right now. We might be stuck in our homes, but there's things that we can envision for the future, doing the research now. But yeah, that's why I think Power to the People, we developed that project and that TV show just so people could see models and the different models that exist. That every project is going to look different within every community. And that just makes sense because every community is different. So I think just like allowing yourself that time to really like reflect. This is like, I know a lot of people are going through a lot of trauma and grief right now. But also if we're able to be safe in our homes and healthy in our homes, take that time to really reflect and think about what can I do? And just think of like doing the research and finding those modelings. And that I think for me is like just trying to be as reflective. Like that's what I've been doing. One of my yoga teachers I've been doing watching online, and he says the yogis right now are saying, take the time to reflect. And I think that's the biggest thing of like the silence and the listening, and the hearing, and then the doing after when we can leave our home safely.
Melissa, there's somebody named Teresa Spitzer. Teresa, are you with us? Yes? Can I invite you?
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So I'm a Métis woman, and I'm in the Vancouver area, and I don't really have many connections to my culture, to that side of my culture at least. Do you have any ideas on how I can start redeveloping those connections?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many Métis resources online now. I used to work for Métis Child and Family Services, so there is a Métis, like I'm Cree, but we also have Métis blood as well. But there is in every single city. That's the amazing thing about there's Métis family services, so that's a place to connect. There's also the Aboriginal Friendship Centers, and those are amazing places to connect. I don't know, have you been to the Friendship Center yet?
Oh.
Okay, so that's like an amazing place that was developed in like the 70s and 80s. Like I grew up learning how to, like in Slave Lake, when we moved to the neighboring town from Little Buffalo, that's where I learned how to like powwow dance. And so they like every Tuesdays and Wednesdays, when it's safe to go back, but like there's powwow night, there's like West Coast nights, you can go and listen to drumming, you can go meet and connect with people. There's a lot of times there's like feasts and like public events. So those are ways to go in to just like connect to people in like, you know, so not so much pressure. You can just go in and sit and like observe and listen. They host events and it's a public space. And so they have friendship centers all over Canada. And so that's like one really great way if you haven't been there. It's like when I first moved to Coast Salish territories, that's where I went because I knew we had a friendship center in like Slave Lake and then in Edmonton. And then I eventually went to Vancouver's Friendship Center and, you know, was able to listen to the drums, listen to teachings, listen to elders, listen to take powwow classes, like take fancy dance classes. So there's just like, that would be like number one, because then from there you can connect with people and then connect with people about ceremony, connect with people and like learn about the other places. But I would say that would be like, if you haven't been there, it's definitely worth going. And then just looking online at Métis connections as well. There's so much more out there. The Métis Nation is like really growing and strong, and we do a lot of collaborations in Alberta around renewable energy projects there too. So they're
Thank you so much.
strong people.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe one last question. We have someone named Shakin. Are you there, Shakin? Can you turn your video on?
Hello, everybody.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hi. Thank you, Melina and Creative Mornings. This is my first time with Creative Mornings and really appreciated the session today. I am a renewable energy specialist at Coast Funds, and we recently helped deliver a program called Renewable Energy for Remote Communities through Clean BC. And I was wondering if anybody out there has any information about other funding sources to help support coastal communities with their renewable energy initiatives.
Yeah, I've spoken at some Clean Energy BC events, but I know a part of the issue is, I think this is a part of the demanding of governments to support communities, because if you are finding, have you been finding it's a struggle to find these types of resources and funds for communities? Is that a problem that you're identifying? Because I know that's what I've heard in BC. In Alberta, we had a renewable energy program with the previous government where, you know, we pushed for a number of years, and then eventually the government, when it switched over, they started releasing funds to communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, to implement renewable energy. And then there was this whole wave of solar projects. The project that I did was actually before that, and so I fundraised myself through actually non-governmental funds. I fundraised through there is organizations like Bullfrog Power and Spark. So there's bigger renewable energy companies that do give smaller funds. So I did that through also philanthropic money. Like I got money from Jane Fonda, who I knew through speaking events around climate change issues. So I was able to like privately fundraise, and then that's how I did it. But because of, I've heard in BC, unfortunately, because of there being like, these are the jurisdictional issues that get bigger, where with BC Hydro being a monopoly in BC, it creates problems and challenges for small scale renewable energy and community owned projects, because Site C, things like Site C have like knocked a number of community-based projects off the table because they won't give access to the grid. And so these are like the political challenges that we deal with governments, when governments side with companies like BC Hydro, and they do large scale, which if there's a cutoff, it's going to present problems for people being cut off from like a large scale dam, if there's a forest fire or all these things. So a lot of smaller communities, which we documented in Power to the People, which they do run of the river, which are small, locally owned, non-invasive, and like don't affect, say like salmon or farming land, which Site C does. It just drops off. Just for people that don't know, run of the river, it's like a micro hydro, so it like basically uses the natural inclination and spins termites at the bottom of the hill through like this small pinhole they call, and then it develops energy that way. So but these types of things are being knocked off the table, so that's why we need to be very aware of these types of policies, because policies really do impact communities when they want to implement and they can't connect to grid. So a lot of times you need to do off grid. So sorry, I'm not giving you like an amazing thing, because unfortunately the BC government hasn't been as active, say like governments like Ontario with the Green Energy Act, where a lot of communities were able to come onto grid. But it is making sure that there's pressure upon these governments to know that communities are watching and saying like, this is not acceptable, because I know that's been a big issue. A lot of communities have actually had their micro hydro grids connections canceled, like for future projects, because of the Site C dam. So things like this, whether or not offering these types of incentives for communities is these types of political decisions that are being made behind closed doors without the input of people in BC. And so that's why we need to continue to push for these types of things. So I'd love to talk to you more about it, but I think federally there's going to be definitely funds, I think, that come out of the incentives. I know right now they did a $1.7 billion bailout for a lot of oil companies, but what we're hoping is in a just transition recovery, that not only will money go to a fossil fuel industry economy, but it will also go to the green energy and renewable energy economy. So we're hoping that federal funds will be made available in the just recovery, just transition. So I hope that there'll be something for communities and organizations like yours that you can do these projects too. But I'd love to talk more, so email me if you can.
We have time for one more question. We are a little bit over time, and people have work as it were these days. So our friend Karen from Montreal, I'm gonna spotlight her, unmute her, and lower her hand, and she can jump in again. There we go. Karen, go ahead.
Hey again. I find it really inspiring the way it's important to look at the culture that you're from, and to like use that, you know, for your community. What kind of advice do you have to get as much knowledge as possible from our grandparents as they get older, whether or not they're like, you know, close within, like I live with my grandmother, but in a lot of people, they don't have access to their grandparents right now. But also, or maybe more specifically, like what kind of information would be a good idea for us to get from our grandparents, like in the, you know, in transmitting their culture to us.
Unmuting thing that's happening. Oh, I think honestly, it's spending time. It's really taking the time to sit with them. I think we're in such a fast-paced world, and I'm guilty of this too. When I go back home, it's actually taking the time to sit with our elders and to like listen and to spend time with them, do like activities with them, like cooking dinner, and that's when the stories come out. You know, like when I go back home and I sit with my auntie who's like in her 70s, and I just like, it's just amazing the amount of stories that she shares, like historical stories, cultural stories, because she's a language carrier, like language. I actually went home to translate part of the TV show for Power to the People. We have the TV shows in Cree as well. And so I went home to like translate, but it takes so much time. And so I think you're so lucky that you live with your grandmother, because a lot of us, like you said, don't. And I think that's the thing that's different between Indigenous cultures and Western cultures, unfortunately, is that a lot of our elders are like in care homes now. And I think that doesn't happen in other cultures where we actually take care of our elders within home. And so that means the knowledge stays within home, stays within community, and isn't siphoned off. And I think, you know, a lot of the elders of Canada like have a lot to say about, like, you know, they might not have stuff like some of them might have even survived the 1918 influenza. I mean, that's getting pretty up there. That's like 102 years old, but they survived the aftermath. They survived, you know, 1930, the 1930s. And so they survived world wars. They survived things that, you know, for us, this is like, oh my gosh, this is like a pandemic. This is like the craziest thing, and it's global, but it's like they've experienced other global issues. And so I think there's a lot of, you know, we talk about our grandparents where, you know, because they were like Depression era survivors, like how they really like took care of things and like let things last for a long, you know, used things till they like couldn't be used anymore. And like, they were like in the survival mode that we're now in. And so I think if we would have learned and listened to our elders, I think we would know better how to survive. You know, everyone had gardens then. They called victory gardens. And so there was like things that unfortunately haven't been carried over into the current day. And now we look at too much social media and too much from the outside, and not from like enough from the inside of us ancestrally, but then also our elders. And so I think that's the biggest difference of the way that our communities and culturally we function differently, even within Canada. So I would say just taking the time to spend, and then the stories come and the teachings come.
That was beautiful.